Hey everyone, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2021, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Intopia, Fable, TPGI Arc, and Adobe, as well as our Gold supporter, Tetralogical. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have questions for the presenters, tweet them using the hashtag ID24 hashtag for our Q&A at the end of the session. Now, I'm thrilled to be joined by our guest host, Bryn. Bryn, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world. We have Kerry Fisher going to talk about accessible SVGs, a masterclass in accessible SVGs, a topic close to my heart, Kerry, and I didn't mention this in the pre-ramble that we were just having. I did actually contribute to an SVG ACT rule, which maybe you're familiar with some of your colleagues from DQ. But anyway, over to you, Kerry. I'm very keen to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction and for allowing me to be part of this awesome event. I am going to kind of talk about accessible SVGs, not kind of, but I will. I call it the masterclass because it's encompassing a lot of the things that I've thought about and researched over the last couple of years. Is there going to be more that you could know? Yes, of course. I can't cover it all in 40 minutes, but I'm going to give you some high level takeaway points and allow you to do some more of that research and figure out what works best for your environment. So again, thanks for the opportunity. My name is Kerry Fisher. I am a senior consultant, accessibility consultant and trainer at DQ. In the day and at night, I am an HCI PhD student at Iowa State University. All right, a little bit about what we're going to do. The first part is a format showdown. So I'm going to, a lot of times people ask me, why are you so obsessed with SVGs? And I say, I'm not really obsessed, but they're really cool. And I never really kind of go into the details of why I think they're so cool or why they might be a good choice for your image needs. But I'm just going to do some quick overview of why it's so important for accessibility in particular. And then we're going to jump into some patterns. Again, I don't have all the time that I want to do, like each one of these could be its own talk. So I'm just going to do high level and talk about some research that I did with SVG patterns and which ones kind of came out on top. Then we'll move into color and contrast and how that relates to SVGs and user choice. And the same thing with animation. So what do we do? What can we do? What should we do, right? So a lot of things to think about. But first, the format showdown. So I'm going to talk about the big four. So there's a lot of different formats for images out there, but the big four are the JPEG, GIF, PNG, and SVG. And they've been around for decades. So which one should you use? Of course, it depends, but let's kind of go into some of the details of what this is. So the JPEG has actually been around since 1986. I imagine some people watching today are younger than JPEGs, and the same with GIFs, 1987. And GIFs were created to replace the JPEG because they were so small. And at that time, we had a lot of slow connections and low bandwidth to deal with. Enter the PNG, 1995. It was kind of here to replace GIFs. So you can see there's a pattern going, right? And then 1999, we got the SVGs, or the scalable vector graphics. So quick rundown here, we have two major types of image files, raster and vector. And if you look real quick, JPEG is raster, GIF is raster, PNG is raster, but SVG is vector. So why do I care between raster and vector? Since those raster images are made up of tiny pixels, it makes them resolution dependent. So if you zoom in on a JPEG, a GIF, or a PNG, it will look pixelated. Whereas vector graphics are digital shapes that are rendered by a computer. So they use mathematical formulas. They're not constrained by size. So they're going to be very sharp, unpixelated as you zoom in. So that's very important for people using screen magnification. For compression will go into two categories of lossless and lossy. So lossless says the image is made smaller, there's no detriment to the quality. But lossy means that the image is made smaller, but at a detriment to the quality. So if I save something in lossy, over and over, the image quality would get progressively worse. And this kind of plays into file size as well. So lossy, poor quality, essentially lossless is good quality. So you can see across the board, mostly lossless, and JPEG for the most part. There is actually a lossless JPEG option, but the lossy variants are most commonly used. So it's not that they don't exist. They're either not supported or not common. All right, so the other part of it is the palette of colors. So we have two distinct categories of color depths, one for indexed and one called direct. So index means that the image can only store a limited number of colors, usually capped at 256. And you have some control by the author, but not something that the user can change. Whereas direct means that you can store millions of colors and they haven't been chosen by that author directly. The browser or the user or the settings could be checking or picking up these colors. So JPEG, as you might imagine, used a lot with photographs. So there's millions of colors. The GIF that replaced the JPEG wanted to be smaller, so it maxed out at 256. Things are a little bit special. There's a PNG 8 version, which is indexed, so it has the same cap at 256, but there's also PNG 24, which is direct. So it's a little bit complex, and I've got lots of notes if you want to learn more about what that means. SVG essentially is called direct. It's a little bit different because, again, it's doing the scale effective graphic. It's not exactly the same as the other formats. But essentially you could call it direct as well. It has an access to that 16.7 million hex colors that are available out in the world. All right, so transparency. So that's another piece of image quality that we want to, or I should say image options that we might want on our site. And JPEGs do not have transparency, I'll say the word, support. GIFs are partially, they're only partially because they're alpha channel, not partial because of alpha channel transparency, meaning like pixels can be fully transparent or fully opaque, but not kind of in between. So if you've ever seen a GIF with like a rough edge, because it doesn't match the background color, that's kind of what that means. So it kind of works, but it's kind of janky. Whereas Ping and SVG are really sharp. So again, they do support that alpha transparency. Animation. All right, so JPEGs at this time, not animated. So there is a JPEG 2000, it does exist. And it was built with animation in mind, but it's only supported by about 18% of the browsers. Probably not a choice that you want. And we all know GIFs are animated. We love the animated GIFs that are out there. And pings can be partially. So there's a thing called Animated Portable Network Graphics, or APing. It's a file format that extends the pings, and it is supported in about 94% of the browsers, but it only works in that PNG 24, not the PNG 8 format. So that's why I kind of put it as partially. Of course, SVGs are using the XML. They can be animated with JavaScript, CSS, or synchronized multimedia integrated language, or SMILE. And SMILE is supported by 97% of the browsers, so you have a lot of options for that. Unlike the other image types that have to be downloaded from the server, external resources, SVGs can be embedded into HTML. Why is this advantageous? It means that it can be searched, it can be indexed, it's great for accessibility, it's great for SEO, and it can be cached as well, whereas the JPEG, the GIF, and the PNG do not have this inline editing. So you can't change it on the fly. So some of the things that we're going to talk about later, like prefers reduced motion, prefers color scheme, user settings, user options, right? They can't affect the JPEG, the GIF, and the PNG on the fly. It's mostly, that would be like replacing images. So SVGs are way more dynamic in that sense. And finally, because it's accessibility and ID24, we talk a little bit about accessibility. And the good news about all formats here is that they all have AT support when it comes to ARIA. And the first three are also alt attributes. So you could, again, putting aside decorative, informative, actionable items and like how you do it or how you'd hide it, the point is that you have multiple options on those, and the same for SVG. So I put ARIA on there, it's the same, but then the tags are a little bit different. They don't have a true alt attribute because again, we're talking about SVG as code versus an image, a direct image format. So it's a little bit different, but the and more means that we can do multiple things beyond just the ARIA and the tags, mostly to do with user choice and interface options. So on the screen, we have a showdown comparison. All the things that I just talked about, just in a visual format. The X means not supported or not a good option. The check mark means, yay, go for it. The check mark with a little asterisk means depending on the specific type, like for instance, that GIF transparency, we know it's only partially supported, or the PNG, it's the PNG 24 versus the 8. So a couple different things there. And then the star I put on for accessibility for SVGs because it goes beyond what the other ones do. They all can support things, but this goes even better, even more. So you can see why I'm a fan, right? At this point, hopefully, like if I convince you of nothing else, at least give SVGs a try. Obviously, you know, depending on what you need, JPEGs are good for things like photographs and gradients. You know, GIFs are good for things like logos and icons and simple animated images, and PNGs, again, images that require transparency, photographs, gradients, that sort of thing. Whereas SVGs can take that and go beyond. So yeah, a little bit of showdown there, hopefully. All right, so getting on to patterns and which SVG patterns are most inclusive for AT users. So this next section outlines the results of some research that I've done with SVG patterns found in the wild, and each kind of alternative description announced when assessed by different combinations of operating systems, browsers, and screen readers. Of course, it's not exhaustive, but it's just kind of a high level view. If you want to read about it, I wrote about this topic in particular because I found that really interesting. And I did it in 2019, and then I revisited it just recently. And then I revisited it right before this talk just to make sure things were up to date. And so I have an update on that as well. But before we get into the actual patterns, let's think about, you know, take a step back and say, what information, what image information needs to be conveyed? So before I even think about code, before I think about patterns, before I think about, I just think about what is it that I'm trying to convey? And that really will help dictate which direction I go. And obviously the second bigger part is, you know, AT support. What am I supporting? Which browsers? What combinations of things am I doing here? So it's really important to just kind of take a step back and think about these things before you actually kind of dive into it. Which is what I just said on this last one too, any framework limitations, other integration factors to consider. One thing that I don't think a lot of people don't think about is how that pattern is going to be used. Like, is it going to be in a pattern library and people are just going to copy paste and not really understand it? Do you have to, are editors going to be accessing it, right? Are users going to be accessing it and being able to modify it? So there's a lot of really, you know, questions about the use case of the pattern that you choose. As I mentioned, there's a complete CodePen. Hopefully somebody can grab that link for me and pop it in somewhere into the YouTube. But this is the CodePen. It's the one that I did, updated 15S. I think that's supposed to be TH. All right, so we're gonna kind of go through these patterns really quickly, but just kind of showing you if you want to kind of dig into it a little bit more. I'm showing right now on my screen a CodePen with all of the 12 patterns that I was testing. Their actual code is in there as well. You can look at it and what I did with the styling. I use Node.js on this one. It's all CSS. And at the bottom, we have a complete table with some similar to what we just saw with the check marks and such. But I'm going to get back to the actual slide. So you can take a look at that and kind of dig into it a little bit deeper than what we're going to do here. So it is there for your use and for you to look at it and let me know how I ruined everything and it's all wrong or something. I appreciate feedback is what I'm saying. So this first group is basic alternative descriptions using the IMG tag. So one thing we didn't talk about with SVGs is they're kind of like two different methods to utilize them. You can treat them just like a regular image format, just like a JPEG or a GIF or a PNG, right? I can have it somewhere on my server and my URL points to it or something points to it, and it's calling it and rendering it from that call. Or I can embed it because it's code straight into whatever it is that whatever framework that I'm using, whatever content management system that I might be using. So it's essentially embedded in line with all the rest of the code that you see in the DOM. And so when you call out for it, you're going to treat it just like you would normally an image tag. So these 4 here, we have the image plus the alt and then some words, right? The alternative text. Then you have the image with the role image with some more. And then we have image, role image, and then ARIA labeled with some words. And then the image, role image, ARIA labeled with an ID. And that ID is linked to expand on the subject and talk a little bit about what it is. So this first group of patterns utilizes the IMG tag linked out to the SVG. And this is a really good choice for basic, uncomplicated images on your website, app, or other digital product. The drawback to using this pattern is that you can't easily control many of those visual elements or animations as you would that inline SVG. So it kind of loses some of the good things that we love about SVGs in the way that we can change it and give our users choice. So, but it is a good choice. And it can also render lighter and faster sometimes than some of the other formats, as we saw before. So depending on how you're using it and where you're using it. All right, so I took that, I did some comparisons both on desktop and mobile. Of course, it's not covering all the things. It's just kind of a sampling of ones that you could use in environments, and also environments that don't quite sometimes match up, right? And I did that on purpose because I wanted to kind of do like a real world scenario where I might be using VoiceOver with Chrome instead of Safari, right? And it's not that you can't do that, right? There's combinations of screen readers and browsers that work best together. They don't have any strange artifacts, but we're users and we're gonna do what we wanna do. And I know a lot of people use VoiceOver, for instance, on Chrome, and they just know that there's gonna get some buggy things occasionally, and that's just part of the process. So, but anyway, if you look at this across the board, we're winning. Like desktop looks great. There was a fun bug that we found about linking out in that image plus alt words without that role equals IMG. And I know Patrick was a part of that conversation and some other people, and it was really interesting. And when I retested it, this actually worked on desktop, whereas before it was kind of buggy in that #1 category there. The same is not true. I still see the bug on the iOS plus Safari plus VoiceOver. And part of that is that, okay, if you think again about what SVGs are, if you don't explicitly add that role of IMG, then the AT device or the browser could say, oh, that's just code. We don't need to look at it. It's not actually an image, even though it's embedded in that IMG tag. So I put a big asterisk here by that #1. I would definitely test it. At this point in time, I say, why not add a role equals IMG to it, just in case it's buggy, or maybe someone's using an older version and it's still not working for them. It's not going to hurt. That's my take on it. But anyway, again, you can argue with me later on Twitter. But so best in show 2 and 3, because I picked those because they have worked on desktop and mobile. And so we have that IMG role equals IMG plus alt, or the IMG with the role IMG and ARIA label. Use with caution. Just the ARIA labeled by isn't fully supported on that mobile testing that I did. Again, results may vary, may see something different. And then possibly avoid not using that role equals IMG because, again, old versions or just kind of, it can be buggy sometimes. So it's not going to hurt to throw that in just to be extra safe. All right, so that was calling out to the SVG. So this one is the inline SVG. And so this second group utilizes for patterns with the SVG tag and the inline SVG file. And so although adding that SVG code directly into the markup could potentially make the page just a tiny bit slower to load, That minor inefficiency will be offset by having more control over the visual elements or animation on your images, like we'll talk in the last two sections. So by adding that SVG to the HTML directly, you have more options when it comes to providing image information to your screen reader. So it's a bonus here as well. So on the screen, I have the 4 patterns that I tested for this one. Again, there are more ones, more patterns combinations that you could test. These are the ones that I chose from the wild. So we have the SVG plus role equals IMG and the title. So these are the SVG, special SVG tags. So title is one of them. The next one uses the text. So the same SVG role equals IMG and text. The next one is using ARIA described by. And then the last one is using the ARIA labeled by. So pretty straightforward. And when I test it, running the various screen readers, different combinations of operating systems and browsers, we see definite patterns emerging in that final results table as well. I think there's a few clear winners here, like number 6, which again is the SVG plus role equals IMG plus text. So one of those SVG tags wasn't fully supported, and it kind of makes sense because that's not what it's meant to do, that particular element, but I have seen that in the wild, so I wanted to test it. The title tag in SVGs is very similar to a alt attribute in a regular image file. So that's kind of what you should think about the title tag as, and it's pretty supported across the board. So that one was the desktop, and here is the mobile. So again, number 6 with that text tag is not doing so well. It's failing or being weird. If you see this caution sign, and I should have said that in the previous one as well, the caution one for the desktop means repeated alternative description. So I say caution because is that a fail? Not really. It tells you what the image is trying to say. But is it annoying? And you could use a different pattern that isn't annoying? Yes. So if you had an option between a pattern that's annoying to screen reader users and AT users, or one that is very crisp and clear and concise, definitely default to not annoying your users. On mobile, it's a little bit different. This caution sign sometimes could be repeated alts, just like we saw on desktop, but some of them are not fully discoverable, which might be a fail. I don't know. You could probably argue one way or the other way. Sometimes I could find the image and hear it in the testing, and sometimes I couldn't. I cheated because I have visual sight, and so I would press the actual image and I could get it to render. So depending how you are using your mobile device and your screen reader on your mobile device, you may or may not encounter it. So I kind of thought of it kind of, let's just use a little bit of caution and maybe avoid that one. So some winners. Number 5 and number 8. So using the title or the title with the ARIA labeled by had the best use. The one with the caution, again, the ARIA described by, it just was annoying and repeated things. You probably want to do that. And that SVG role IMG with text just kind of failed across the board, number 6. All right, so now extended patterns. So the last group of patterns utilizes that SVG tag as well with the inline SVG file, much like the group we just saw. However, in this case, we're extending that simple alternative description with additional information due to the complexity of the image. So imagine you had a complex image that you really need to describe with more information that you would in a typical alt description. So this is a really good choice for complicated patterns, need more explanation. One word of caution is that keep in mind there are some people with disabilities, like cognitive disorders, who might benefit from having this additional information just in HTML, like or on the screen or the toggle or somewhere on the screen that they can see instead of embedded within the SVG code. But depending on your use case, you may want to do that or both. So depending on the type of information you want to add to your SVG, you might consider taking that completely different approach and adding that to your HTML. Well, let's assume you don't. Let's say you want to embed it all. So I took a look at, oops, I think I didn't describe that one. All right, so the four that I'm testing here are the SVG role equals image with a title and a text, SVG role equals image, title, and description. It's very similar to maybe like the old long description that we used to use. SVG role equals image, title, description with an ARIA labeled by, and then the same with an ARIA described by. So I kind of showed this one already. Skipped ahead to get a little bit excited here, but all these cautions on this one are repeated alt descriptions. So, or text or description is ignored. So depending on your use case, you might want to use caution with some of those. Missing, again, the text or the description might be critical, and that might be a stopping point for you. It might be a fail for you, but for other people, it might not be. So that's why I put the caution. Definitely mileage may vary. So yeah, I mean, as long as you're aware of those limitations and it can accept them, that is your personal choice. And but I definitely would encourage you to use the one that's the most supported for the widest range of AT users. So that's a desktop version. And here's the mobile version. So you can see there's definitely some patterns that are kind of coming to the top. The best in show really in this case is only one of them. The SVG role equals image with a title, description, and the ARIA labeled by. So much information that you could pack into that small little snippet, right? And it's only a few extra characters, a little bit more code, but not really a heavy lift there. Being careful of that description. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's redundant, sometimes it goes missing. So you could use it, but definitely test it on the environments that you are going to be supporting. And you possibly want to avoid the ones with title and text. Just doesn't give a full explanation of what's going on in that title description with ARIA described by. So a lot of pattern goodness in a very short amount of time. Definitely check out that code pin if you want to dig deeper. When I retested it right before this talk, not a lot had changed, just that one kind of buggy one that we were seeing with Safari and VoiceOver on desktop. So that is good news. In the past couple of months, at least, that's been resolved. So happy with that. All right, so format. Now we talked about patterns, and now we're going to kind of move on to color and contrast. So we typically focus on accessible SVGs. We really often think about that screen reader compliance, but as we all know, or we all should know, that's only part of the issue and part of the solution. If we step back and think about people with low vision and color blindness, they really outnumber people who are blind 14-to-1. So it's you want to support both, but just definitely want to take your SVGs beyond just screen reader compliance and think about other kinds of users, including people with visual issues. So if you're familiar with WCAG guidelines and color and contrast, you should be. I hope you are. It's been around for a while, so definitely the same rules that apply to those things also apply to these images. When you talk about WCAG guidelines around color contrast, it's this non-text contrast, so it's not necessarily the same ratio. It's the 3-to-1 that you're looking at for these essential images. So if you have a decorative SVG, technically it doesn't necessarily have to meet that success criterion. But if you have an essential SVG, like maybe you have a home button and nothing else on the page, no other text, it's essential. If it disappeared, you wouldn't know what to do. It definitely needs to meet that guideline. So that's kind of your first step there. Because color and contrast has been something part of some WCAG guidelines for so long, there are tons of helper tools. So you can do it in the design level, you can do it in the coding level, you can do it in the dev, production, whatever it is that you want to do, you can do it all over the place. There's so many color contrast tools, checker tools. I love, of course, the color contrast checker analyzer, I should say, from TPGI. I use it on every single assessment, and there's a lot of reasons why I like to use it, but mostly because I can grab colors from anywhere. And so if I have an SVG, for instance, on top of a gradient, I can just kind of pick the pieces that I wanted to check around it. Or if I happen to have one on top of an image, that would be pretty busy, but you never know, it could happen. So the idea is that I could use that tool and kind of test around it. So if you haven't seen that tool yet, definitely take a few minutes and check that one out. It's really nice. Otherwise, again, message me. I've got a whole list of other ones that you might like. But the really, big star for me for SVG is that prefers color scheme. And it's pretty awesome. So I know that other people have written about it. Other people have done research about this as well. It's supported by 89 to 92% of all browsers. So it's definitely popular. It's definitely being supported. It's one of those things that definitely is helping people with their color contrast issues. So if you're not familiar with it, it's the @Media Query prefers color scheme, and it allows a user to choose a light or dark theme based on my user settings. And this is and somebody asked me once, like, hey, if I just have like a dark mode and that one's accessible, but I don't have a light mode that's accessible, does that count? Will I get sued? Like, I'm not a lawyer, but yes, you need to have both of them needs to be accessible. Both of them have to meet that color contrast ratio. You can't just say dark mode is my accessible theme and light is not. They should both be accessible. So be cautious of that. All right, so 2 options here for the CSS. Of course, you can do this with JavaScript. You've done that for years with JavaScript with the toggle, basically toggling a theme, changing colors, that sort of thing. This is a little bit different. This is within the CSS, and I can choose my color scheme based on, again, my preferences from a user side, but the developers can add and the designers can build a new theme. I can code it with a few extra lines of code. Usually it's not as heavy as the first main theme. And, I've given my user an option. Do you want dark or do you want light? There used to be this one called no preference. It was being used for a while, but only 18% of browsers are actually using that. All right. I'm talking too fast. So I'm watching my time. So there's a lot of different examples out there. I just wanted to show you real quick. Here's the prefers color scheme and the support. The reason why I have that range is because we see down here, it's a little bit in this research, a little less supported, but the major players and the major new versions are pretty supported. So that's good. Here's just a really close up of the dark mode example that I showed. I have a theme and then I write prefers color scheme, and if I start light, I may go dark, or if I start dark, this could go light, right? So depending on where you start, add a little bit of code. I'm just kind of running through that, but it's not that exciting. But basically, I'm changing the things that I know the mode has to change. So for instance, here is my website. Let me go to preferences. Here you go. So right now we're in dark mode because that was my preference. I go to general on Mac. Again, the PC will be a little bit different. I go to light. You can see my background changed. So if I am on, let's see, pull this down a little bit. Here's another, there you go. Too many tabs open. All right, so here's one that I did earlier. This is also a light mode. If I go dark mode, we have our chameleon in the dark. So I can totally change the scene. I could change anything. I could swap images as well. There's a lot of different variations. I did that with this one as well. So this is one pattern that somebody else made, color changing buttons. If I press the buttons, they change. And what I wanted to show is that I could modify this and make it a little bit more accessible, but visually it doesn't change too much, right? You saw the color change a little bit, right? A little bit darker, a little bit of outline. But if I go from dark to light on this one, my buttons change color as well. So just kind of a small change, showing you that it doesn't have to be radical. It doesn't have to be completely different. It can really stay true to the original design. I think a lot of people get hung up on you know, accessibility might be ugly, or I have to completely change everything. And that's not necessarily true. I think there's a lot that you can do within the constraints of that design constraint and stay true to the feeling of the design, but also make it accessible and make it usable by so many more people. So, I mean, what's not to love? All right, so in conjunction with color and contrast, how your SVG moves on the screen is another important aspect to consider when designing and developing with inclusiveness in mind. And of course, we go back to the WCAG motion guidelines. They're super clear. We'll get into that in the second step. Even before I get to that, my first question is always, does it need to move? Does it really? Actually, does it really? Like all these little micro movements that are made to delight our users. I don't know about you, but even without a vestibular disorder and you know, nothing, it doesn't necessarily trigger me in that way, but it does trigger me in the other way where I find them really annoying. I'm going through a page and things are flying in and out, and even little things, like I get super annoyed really fast. I get distracted by them as well. So people with ADHD, obviously visual disorders, vestibular disorders, they don't like those. People with seizure disorders as well, depending on how quick movement is or if it's a jarring change, right? So my first question was always, you know, do we need that movement? All right, so, but if you say, yes, we need that movement. All right, so go back to the guidelines. We have that pause, stop, hide. It's pretty clear. It's that lasts more than 5 seconds, or it's part of page elements that it must allow user to pause, stop, or hide. So there's a lot of different options there for movement. Take a look at that one. That is 222. You may want to check out 231 if you think that it's also getting into that category of flashing. So you definitely want to make sure that it's not causing seizures or other physical disabilities to be triggered. And just like the SVG in color contrast, we also have animation options. So love it. I'm loving all of these media queries that we're getting and that are getting supported. This one's 93% supported. There's other ones that are out there that are less supported. So I'm happy to see these. Like, I want all the browsers to support all the media queries. Give users all the choices. That would be ideal, definitely. So the two options here, if you're going the CSS route, again, you could probably do this with JavaScript or another way to do it if you had embedded GIFs. But again, we're talking about SVGs, we're talking about the CSS options. We have a prefers reduce motion, reduce, or no preference. So the no preference, or if you didn't have anything, that's just what a designer or a developer decides to be served up, that's what you get. And so we want to give your users choices, and that's one way to do it. So just going to show that real quick, and then I'm getting close to the end here. So definitely supported by a lot of browsers. There's a few of them that are kind of strangely not supported, like Opera, IE, we can kind of ignore a little bit, but and some older browsers to consider. Just like we saw on the, oops, I think it's actually the other way. Just like we saw in the prefers color scheme, I can have a media query that just says prefers reduce motion and reduce. I've added a little bit of code and basically stop the motion. So there's that other question of, you know, how do you want to reduce it? Do you want to reduce it fully and just have no motion? Or do you want to give even a slight movement change? I believe Eric Bailey, who happened to be one of the people on this one, has talked a lot about that. And I'm definitely +1 to his idea that just go no motion, right? If someone's clicking prefers reduce motion, they don't want to see motion. So just give them an experience that they're asking for. Don't reduce motion. That still might not be enough for them. So if I go back to this, we're on dark mode real quick. Okay, so again, I'm on the Mac, and now I go to accessibility. Now I go to display, and I press reduce motion. And if you saw, there's a subtle change. I had some movement in the background. When I press reduce motion, it stopped the movement. If I go back over here, whoops, let's do the bigger one. All right, now my reduce motion is on. So when it's off, things move, the eyeball moves, the color moves, the rocket moves on this guy, and I press reduce motion, and I've chosen to stop it. So that's that one. Even this one, I've done a little bit with reduced motion, because when I move it, oops, let's get this guy out of the way. Just believe me though, when I press it. So there's kind of some motion to the button when I press it and the color change. And on mine, I kept the same, but when I press reduce motion, you can see it's a little more subtle, right? It doesn't expand long. So it's a small change, but it's enough to help users who have issues with vestibular disorders or some sort of motion illness that they do not want to see that motion, or maybe they just are like me and they don't like it. So quick recap, I'm getting close to the end here. I knew I would be because there's so much to talk about. Yeah, I wish I had like a forum of like 4 hours or something. We could totally geek out on SVGs and like super complex ones. This is the tip of the iceberg, obviously. And these are for, you know, not just, but SVGs within the constraints of like a website or an app. There's so much that's going on with like data visualization and SVGs, just amazing. It blows my mind. I know Sarah Hiley and Doug Sheppers, I know are big ones in that field as well, and accessibility, so check that out. But for now, let's just talk about this simple SVG recap here. So we think, if maybe you followed along, you agree that is a clear format winner. Of course, you know, context is important if you need a photograph or something. But it's won on resolution, compression, colors, transparency, animation, inline editing, and accessibility. Pattern options, we have so many pattern options no matter what AT you're supporting, browsers, mobile devices, lots of support. And with color and contrast, for both of these, with a few lines of extra code, we have accommodated more visual needs and more motion needs of our users. And who doesn't love choices? So I'll end with this thought that for people without disabilities, technology makes things easier. And for people with disabilities, technology makes things possible. That was written way back a long time ago in 1991 in the IBM training manual. But I feel like we're finally getting to that point where technology is making things so possible for people with disabilities. And I'm so happy to be a small part of that. And that's it. So anyway, thank you all. If you want to find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, that's the information there.
Wow, wow, wow. That was
sorry, that was a lot.
Well, it was a lot, but it was fantastic. And you survived the live demo as well, which definitely deserves a medal. Lots of love on Twitter coming in for you, Kerry. Really, really, really good presentations. I mentioned before, I did actually try to contribute an ACT rule around SVG. I think you're probably better off writing that rule yourself. And no, I think
I only stand on the shoulders of giants and the people who came before me, so I appreciate it.
But it's so nice to see the sort of the context in comparison with all of those things as well. I've got a couple of questions.
Sure.
That I'm not very good at multitasking here, but anyway, I'm going to give a question coming from Eric. What about support for using SVG plus role IMG plus ARIA label? Is that something that you looked at?
Yeah, I did look at that one as well. I probably should update that. I think the support is even greater, and that's why I didn't focus on that one as much, because I think that's the one that a lot of people do use as well. I kind of wanted to test some of the other ones, but yeah, that's a good point. I'll definitely add that one to the mix because I do think that a lot of people use that. I did show that one in the IMG tag version, but
yes,
obviously it doesn't behave exactly the same. So
I saw that. Yeah, no, I did. Yeah. I did mention that. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
That's a good observation, and definitely something I should add to the research. What am I saying?
Eagle-eyed Eric. Yeah. No, well, the table was massively appreciated on Twitter, so that would be cool. Yeah, it'd be great to share that. Another question: is it fair to assume that forced colors media query which triggers Windows High Contrast Mode, can be addressed by devs similarly to the prefers reduced colors MQ.
Yeah, and I believe it's not as
Media query.
supported. Yeah, I would have to look at the actual numbers to see what it was, but I remember that it's only, as you know, like supposed to be for a certain operating system, whereas that the prefers color scheme, prefers reduced motion are kind of more universal, and it seems to be trending in that direction as far as the support and what people are using. So I like to use the things that are, I like to do a one and done, right? Like why add all the media queries if you don't need to? But you could also just throw it into your CSS line as well. If you've already got what you're reducing or what you're changing color-wise, I don't see why you couldn't add that in as well. So yeah, definitely something to think about and to look into.
Good. Okay. And
I don't have all the answers. Also.
No, that's fair
Yeah.
enough. No. Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot to think about in there, but hopefully that's answered Adrian's question there. I had a question around the kind of the future or potential of SVG. And I know there's a lot more roles within SVG than the IMG role that you can add, like graphics objects and various data objects and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
What I was thinking about accessible graphs, and that type of thing. Is that? Do you feel that SVG is not really, we're yet to see the potential of SVG as sort of an accessible alternative to standard sort of image graphics and things like that?
I think the people who are working on that and thinking about data visualization in particular already see that potential. And I know there's like high charts and some other graphical interfaces that have those capabilities within the SVGs and dynamic SVGs and changing the essentially the alt on the fly based on the parameters within the graph. And so I do think that that's the future as far as integrating graphs and giving the best user experience to all kinds of people, especially our AT users. It's, it can be complicated. It can be, like anything in accessibility, you have to know your world. And then on top of that, you have to know all the accessibility parts to it. So I think that's just like kind of the hang up with a lot of these more innovative solutions and the way that we're progressing. Like, I think we're all going to get there eventually, but there's just got to be a few of us that have to kind of blaze that trail a little bit or think about these questions in a deeper way. But yeah, I definitely think SVGs are that's funny to call them the wave of the future when they've been around since 1999, but people are finally catching on to certain things. I think that's amazing. So yeah, SVG all the things. That's actually what I wanted to call this talk.
Fair enough. It's good. It's nice to hear you talk about it like that. I always think about some of these new technologies. They have to sort of a bit like they need to survive the mini disc phase,
laser disc.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So
8 tracks.
yeah, absolutely. Great, fantastic. Well, I'm going to thank you very much again. I'm going to hand back to Eric to close the session.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Carrie, again, a fantastic talk. Super appreciate it. I also thank you for all the research and the work you've put in. I've definitely sent that to lots of people and used it myself as well. So just phenomenal stuff. If you like this session, you can hit that like button on YouTube. And also don't forget that you can subscribe at youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop for future events. Also a reminder that ID24 is a respectful community and that you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our supporters, Intopia, Fable, TPGI Arc, Adobe, Tetralogical, Intuit, InfoAxia, Center for Inclusive Design, Web Directions AAA, Adrian Rioselli, LLC, and Ken Access. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session. Looking forward to seeing you all then.